Welcome to a new video, y'all. I'll be going over my process of this painting and, just as important, some tricks to working with acrylic that I've learned in my 8+ years of working with acrylic paint. I started with my sketch, which I lightly removed with a kneaded eraser before adding a quick wash of brown acrylic for a neutral background. Once I had that done, I moved on to painting the robe, a darker blue, almost teal color. One thing about painting with acrylic that I do in particular is trying to limit the amount of visible brush strokes. In order to do so, I maintain the balance between water and paint, enough to keep the paint fluid but not entirely transparent. On the lighter side of the robe, I kept this darker color limited to the shadow areas, so I could later blend it out with the lighter blue. I also painted around certain areas, doing my best to keep them paint free for the stars I would add later on. While not entirely necessary, keeping those areas free from a dark background would let the yellow stars I plan to add appear brighter. This could also be done by simply adding white to those areas before painting the stars, but I figured this way would save me time in the long run. As you can see on the lighter side of the robe, I added thinner lines of the dark teal and would blend it out lightly afterwards by cleaning my brush and letting the water do the work for me. Having this sort of transition area allows me to blend the lighter teal easily with the shadows. There are a few different ways to blend acrylic. In this instance, I layered my colors to create the illusion of blending without having to actually blend the paint. In the darker areas of the robe, I also made sure to add more water than paint to my paintbrush, so that it wouldn't be an extreme jump in values. In this area, I also did a bit of dry brushing to only slightly add dimension. When it came to painting the golden-like trim of the robe, I mixed a warm yellow, and I did this by mixing a yellow that I had with some brown. Once I had the entire trim painted, I added more brown to my paint mix and use this darker gold on the folds and shadow of the trim. Possibly one of the most time-consuming parts of this 10 plus hours of painting were the stars, which were both numerous and small. Additionally, I used the paint that I saved from the robe to clean up the stars when necessary. Using the same gold color I previously mixed for the trim, I added some white and began drawing the lines to form said stars. On the darker side of the robe, I used the golden color paint from the trim as is. And on that side, I did try to be a little bit more careful when placing the lines for the stars, just because the robe had some different shades of teal that I had already blended and didn't really want to mess that up. Afterwards, I focused on using my remaining paint from the robe, using it on both the angel and the half crescent moon. Something I always try to keep in mind while painting is cohesion between color. And when you're someone who's maybe not used to working with color or finds it a little bit daunting, working with a limited color palette is a great way to sort of solve that issue. And for example, while I do end up having various colors, they are all different shades of the same couple of colors, like the different shades of teal. Meanwhile, for the background, I flipped a lot between having a light brown, like the Virgen de Guadalupe typically has as a color for a background, or between a darker color. In the end, I went for a dark gray, so I could have the most contrast in values between the background and the central figure. Like with the rest of the painting, I started with a somewhat thin layer of paint and then going back in for a second coat of paint for solid coverage. When it came to the dress, I did end up changing the shade of brown quite a few times. The first just felt too dark, and then it was too yellow, and finally I did get somewhat comfortable with the color of the paint. And while the jump in values seems intense between the lighter side of the dress and the darker, it did end up working quite well once the other areas were painted in. I also used one of the darker colors from the dress to paint in the rays of light that would be emitting behind the Virgin. Nearing the end, I focused a lot on the smaller details, like the pattern on the dress. Instead of creating this sort of floral pattern using paint, I opted to use color pencils instead, as I felt it would give me a little more control on line weight. I also decided to slightly lighten the background, as the value of it was simply a little bit too close to the actual dress, making it sort of blurred together instead of standing out like I wanted it to. And of course, I did add a little bit of ink in certain areas, such as the face of the Virgin as well as the angel. And here we have the finished painting. While this is a typical size that I work with, it was filled with a lot more smaller details than what I typically do, making it feel like a new experience. In the end, I'm really happy with how the painting turned out. I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next week with a new one.